Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the worshiper of a false god and the follower of a false prophet. The false god that he worshiped was Buddha, and the prophet that he enamored and followed was Gandhi. Buddha is the Buddha that Dr. King worshiped, and the prophet of Buddha, Gandhi, were, as you may be aware, the Buddhas have succeeding sons. And if I'm not mistaken, Dr. King's worship was of the 14th Buddha that was in the earth at the time. And the prophet, of course, that had followed Buddha in terms of Gandhi was not. 2 weeks ago, I explained that Satan had power to interrupt the plan of God, Jesus, and many of you were shocked, as I'm sure you should have been. And I did so out of the verse 13 that I just read, and I'm glad I started there today, where Daniel is spoken to by a servant of the Lord. And this servant declares that he had come to Daniel with an answer from God, but that Prince of Persia stopped him and prevented him from his appointed rounds. The religious tactics of Dr. King were unbiblical. They not only were unbiblical, but they were demonic. Now that's hard to hear. It's difficult to receive, and it's not, and I don't want to fulfill any prophecies myself, but Buddha and nonviolence has made such an impact. And then who am I? James David Manning, standing behind a desk in Harlem on 123rd Street. Who am I? And why would you believe? And that the anthem that should be quoted today across the media and across placards and written across the streets of Harlem should not be Black Lives Matter, but it should be Outlaw 50,000 righteous men should be written on 7th Avenue. You might notice, however, as well, that they put that Black Lives Matter right where we want to put the ark of those in the Middle Passage. You might note that that's where they put it. So you see, what God wanted established, and you see what Satan is. But who's going to listen to that? Not a lot of people. But Dr. King was unbiblical, and his teachings were demonic. And demonic practices that has led us, we most heard recently in the recent funeral of Representative John Lewis, who also was a demon worshiper and a follower of Dr. King in the nonviolent movement. I think it's important as well to appreciate historically that Dr. King in the early days was not received either. Dr. King was not received by the leading Baptists and the leading Black Christians as they were. Dr. King was opposed by many notable Christians of his day. My pastor, Stanley, loved a Chicago preacher named Joseph Harrison Jackson. Dr. Jackson was the president of the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated. And you have to say it like that because there are two National Baptist Conventions. Baptists like to multiply by dividing. So you have to say he was the president of the National Baptist Convention, USA and Incorporated, so you don't get National Baptist Convention of America. Joseph Harrison Jackson, pastor of a great church in Chicago, very charismatic, and erudite, and one of the strongest leaders that the National Baptists had. He cursed Dr. King to his face and never once allowed the National Baptist Convention and its 30,000 churches in America and church members in America to march with Dr. King, Dr. Joseph Harrison Jackson. The Reverend Dr. Clay Evans, also of the Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church in Chicago, and a contemporary of James Cleveland, and a great singer, writer of songs, and just a flowing preacher, Reverend Dr. Clay Evans. Also opposed Dr. King. Dr. King, while doing his habitation in Chicago and the Poor People's Campaign, came to the Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church in Chicago for the Baptist Ministers Conference one Monday morning. And the church was packed with Baptist preachers. And Dr. Clay Evans pulled out a .38, marched out of the pulpit with his .38. Some preachers carry guns in the pulpit. It's a good thing. No problem. No problem. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that. Put that gun to Dr. King and his group and tell him, get out of here and don't you ever come back. And the reason why Dr. Clay Evans, Dr. Cleveland, Dr. Jackson, and other pastors across America of the Hamite hue did not follow King is because they didn't hear him preaching about Jesus. It's quieted down now, but I remember carefully sitting one day in an old beat-up station wagon, Chevrolet station wagon, that was rusted floor. The seats were all rusted out. It was an awful automobile. Listen to Pastor Stanley tell me of these historical events. He loved Dr. Joseph Harrison Jackson. And when he first started the ATLAH Church up on 8th Avenue, he had a young group of people, like I have as men of the East or women of the East, had a young group of people called the Joseph F. Jackson Jacksoneers. And they'd come in as children honoring Dr. Jackson. They told me about this, about how Dr. King was not accepted because he wasn't preaching Jesus. And they understood that he was coming from Buddha and not from our Savior, and they rejected him. But it's all quieted down now. It's all got washed under the bridge, and now he's the greatest of the greatest. But he was unbiblical. He was transcendental in his Henry David Thoreau teachings. And he would condemn Jesus. Dr. King was eulogized. And there was the viewing of the body. And Daddy King of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, where that awful ceremony took place last week for John Lewis, never marched with his son. Never. Even with his receiving of the Nobel Peace for Prize in Stockholm, his mother never marched with him. His father and mother cannot be found among the marchers, the ones that are supporting Dr. Daddy King here, as he's known. Never. He told his son, Martin, what you doing? Martin, he said, Martin, what you doing? Leave that mess alone and preach the gospel, Martin. What you doing, Martin? He told his children, he told his son. So you won't find him marching with his son. So just in case somebody wants to rail against me, one of these pinch-nosed Negroes who live up on Teddy Bear Lane, a black man with dreadlocks married to a white man, or some black man like Van Jones married to a white woman want to challenge me, before you challenge me, go and challenge Dr. King Daddy, because his daddy knew he was a Buddhist and follower of a false god. Daddy knew it. Mama too. Then you can talk to me. But when King was eulogized, the viewing of the body, Daddy King came to the casket and he broke down. Not because he was sorry that his son died, but I'm sure he broke down because he thought it was such a waste. But at any rate, he was unbiblical. And not just that, but Daddy King, Clay Evans, Dr. Jackson realized that King was condemning Jesus with his nonviolence. He was condemning the God of the flood of Noah, who killed women and children in the flood. King was condemning that with nonviolence. Not just that, but King was condemning Abraham and the God who sent slaughter upon Sodom and Gomorrah. That was not nonviolent. King was condemning that when he preached nonviolence. Daddy King knew it, and so did Dr. Jackson, that King was condemning Moses for killing the Egyptian and hiding his body in the sand. You see, nonviolence would not kill. King was condemning that. King was condemning the death of every firstborn, not just one person killed, but Moses came back later with more power, and every firstborn by the tens of thousands were killed to set the Jews free. But King wasn't for that. He condemned that. That was not the way of King. King was condemning the drowning of the soldiers' horses, I'm sure, and the army in the Red Sea. King condemned Joshua for killing Achan and shouting around the great wall of Jericho. King condemned that. King was condemning David for slaying Goliath. King was wholeheartedly nonviolent. Though he was beaten, he did not beat back. He was condemning David. King was condemning Elijah for beheading 850 prophets on Mount Carmel one day after God had answered him by fire. King was condemning that. Daddy King knew it, and every other person of God knew it. The king was condemning the Bible, condemning God and Jesus. King was condemning. And the movement, like Black Lives Matter now, has become the cry of the people. The churches, after and up into the death of Dr. King, he was not, I told you last time we were together, that his movement had waned, that the media was no longer interested in his movement, his nonviolence. They had killed James Meredith, and Medgar Evers had been killed, and the 3 freedom riders had been killed and burned in a car in Mississippi. They were no longer interested in King, the media, because that's where he got his power from. The same way Black Lives Matter got their power 2 months ago. All you could see on television 24/7 was Black Lives Matter marching. They didn't even talk about the coronavirus. That was important. Though thousands were dying each day, they did not report on coronavirus. Black Lives Matter dominated the liberal media, Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, and all the others. And that's where King got his power from. And the more the media followed Black Lives Matter, the stronger they grew. But at one point they said, this King guy, even his people are not following him, and not his people, but he's not that important, so they stopped. So King, in a desperate move with C.T. Vivian and that homosexual that was his chief of staff, said, King, we got to get the media back down here to get attention, because if the media don't cover us, we're nobody. So they decided to go to Birmingham and challenge Bull Connor by putting teenagers from the 9th through 12th grade on the street one day. And it was a massacre. I mean, it was a massacre. To see Bull Connor release those dogs, they come to that event with dogs and fire hoses thinking perhaps they were going to be adults, but it turned out to be children, 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds. And you've seen some of the footage of them being pushed up against the wall with those powerful fire hoses, or the dogs biting at those, nipping at those. You saw it, you've seen it. But they were children. These were not adults. It was a school day. It wasn't a holiday. But Dr. King, in the last effort to be relevant, used such tactics as that. Many have condemned him for doing so. But that brought the media back and got the world's attention once again. I have to say as well that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, though a lot of people attribute it to King, they forget it was Adam Clayton Powell, Mr. Show Enough Playboy himself, that got that work done. and wrote that legislation. To this very day, nobody has passed more legislation in Congress than the Playboy right here from the 15th district of New York City, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. He was a wizard, and King got the credit. and Reverend Powell, Adam Clayton, died on Bimini, being attacked by his own people. But the churches began to preach this false doctrine during his last days and after his death. And it is now mushroomed as the doctrine for black people. John Lewis, who got beat up on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, so the first one got beat. And all of a sudden, Obama was down there again, pouncing around, realizing they won't and not too many days now, the long-legged Mac Daddy's going to be president again when Biden gets elected. You should have seen them parading down there this past week at the Ebenezer Church. It was a farce if I've ever seen one. And that has become the doctrine, nonviolence. John Lewis, Dr. King, nonviolence. You might also note, and I think I can say this parenthetically, that Stokely Carmichael, I don't know how many of y'all remember Miriam Makeba, Pata, 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 Pata from South Africa. If you haven't heard that, listen to that. Pata, Pata, Pata. Miriam Makeba and got hooked up with Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael wasn't for this nonviolence. He told King to his face, I ain't for this. You hit me, I'm hitting back. And so it's important that we're in the, but Rap Brown, Stokely Carmichael, Black Power, these are contemporaries of Dr. King. So for those who are challenged by what I'm saying, you're historically ignorant and probably spiritually deficient. And so you think I'm some sort of a monster. You think that I'm somehow, I'm not God's servant, that no one would ever say such things about Dr. King. But you talk to the contemporaries of his day. Talk to Stokely Carmichael. Talk to Rap Brown. You can't talk to Dr. Jackson or his own father and mother who knew him, who said these things before I said them. But Rap Brown and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also a nonviolent organization. But nonviolence didn't sell that well. It wasn't really. But it's now become the anthem of all the politicians who are trying to be the next Dr. King. But it was based on the false doctrine of the 14th Buddha and his prophet, Mahatma Gandhi. So the churches are preaching this false doctrine. In the Pentecostal churches, they're preaching it. The African Methodist churches, they're preaching it. The Baptist churches, they're going wild. They're drowning the Presbyterian, the Episcopalians, the Catholics. They're drowning in nonviolence. They're drowning in worshiping this prophet of Buddha, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This truth needs to be told because many are being deceived. Well, they said Jesus said, turn the other cheek. Jesus also said, think not that I've come to send peace on earth, but I've come to bring a sword. And sell your garments. Now it's time to buy one if you don't have one. It's important that we understand that Dr. King refuted Moses. He did. And he had this famous statement. You hear them now pontificating, thinking they're sounding so smart. Well, as Dr. King said, an eye for an eye will leave us all blind. But Moses said, to hell with it. Eye for an eye, hand for a hand, foot for foot. And Moses didn't change that. But Dr. King said that's not the way. He challenged Moses the same way Barak, who sang the long-legged Mac Daddy, or challenged Moses on shellfish and swine. And the Beatitudes. Obama laughed at Moses. He laughed. And no one in the church seems to notice. I heard that. I said, how could they do this to Moses? I'm not going to let Obama get away with laughing at the Bible. I'm not going to do it. I didn't get anybody to follow me, but I'm still standing here. You're not going to challenge Moses. You're not going to do that. Not as long as I got breath in my body. I don't care who the hell you are, Obama, your mama, or nobody else. Moses said an eye for an eye. Hand for hand, foot for foot. You take mine, I take yours. And we might all end up blind, but we'll end up just. So, Jesus was not the leader of Dr. King. In fact, if you think about all the speeches, you don't remember hearing him say very much about that. About Jesus. You don't remember hearing him quote the verses. You don't remember. And he was able to get away with this. And now it's a poison inside the churches that has now risen up as Black Lives Matter. Mahatma Gandhi got all the credit for the work of Dr. King. And Buddha got the credit for the work of Gandhi. Of a news blog we do looking at spiritual wickedness in high places for the most part, making some observations about it and giving people a biblical foundation to the way of interpreting rather than have Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham or Janine Pirro or Anderson Cooper or Rachel Maddow or Don Lemon, Rush Limbaugh interpret what's going on in the world. You come to me and I'll tell you based on what the Word of God says. They'll just give you their worldly, sinful view. But the Manning Report will tell you what God has said, whether to say yea or nay, whether to go or to stay. You'll be led by the word of Almighty God. Come to the Manning Report on a daily basis to interpret the spiritual wickedness in high places, because there's plenty of it that's going on. And so I'm the Lord's servant, James David Righteous Rebel Manning, and I'm here to serve you with news and information.